Okay, now we're going to start talking about the urinary system. Now, we've already touched on some of the functions of the urinary system, or the kidneys in particular, when we talked about how the kidneys help to regulate blood volume and blood pressure by moving sodium into or out of the blood. We've also talked about how the kidneys sense the oxygen level of the blood, and when it's hypoxemic, secrete the hormone erythropoietin to stimulate the bone marrow to synthesize new red blood cells. What we haven't talked about are two other functions, one of which we're going to focus on in this chapter, and one of which will be the focus of the next chapter. What we're going to focus on in this chapter is how the kidneys filter our blood in order to remove toxic substances known as nitrogenous wastes. In the next chapter, we'll also look at how the kidneys help to regulate the pH of our blood. But before we get to the filtration, let's take a moment and look at the anatomy. In fact, we're going to have to take lots of moments and look at the anatomy. This is a very anatomy-rich topic. So the urinary system consists of two kidneys, which you see here. You can see the adrenal glands on top. Those are actually not part of the urinary system, but are part of the endocrine system. However, they interact quite a bit. The kidneys are where filtration of the blood takes place. And once the blood is filtered, the clean blood goes back into the renal veins, which you see here in blue, and then take the blood into the vena cava back to the heart. The substance containing the nitrogenous waste, known as urine, is carried via these tubes called ureters. So there's one ureter leading from each kidney to this holding tank known as the bladder. The bladder is there to store the urine until we're ready to eliminate it from the body, and when that moment comes, the urine passes to the outside of the body through a tube known as the urethra. Now, most of our focus is going to be on the kidneys. However, I want to say a couple of things about the urethra before we move on. One is that it has two muscular sphincters. Sphincter just means a circular muscle that helps to control opening and closing of a tube or an orifice. And so the urethra has two sphincters, an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter. The internal one is made of smooth muscle and is under involuntary control, which means that it's the autonomic nervous system that controls whether that sphincter is open or closed. With parasympathetic stimulation, the internal sphincter opens and will allow urine to pass to the outside of the body. That means you have to be relaxed in order to urinate. And if you've ever experienced stage fright in a public restroom, you know what I'm talking about. The external sphincter is made of skeletal muscle and is under voluntary control. And this is the muscle that we learn as toddlers during potty training to have some control over, to determine not just whether we're relaxed enough or not to urinate, but also whether it's the appropriate time and place. Now, one other thing I want to mention about the urethra is that it's very different in males and females. In females, the urethra is quite short. Here's the internal sphincter and the external sphincter that I was talking about. But in males, the urethra actually passes through the penis to the outside of the body. And when we get to the reproductive system, we'll talk about how the urethra is actually shared with the reproductive system in males. In any case, the urethra is much longer in males than in females. And one of the consequences of that is that in females, urinary tract infections are much more common. And this is because bacteria, usually bacteria from the anus, if they get into the urethral opening, they don't have to travel very far to reach the bladder or to take hold inside the urethra. and bladder and create a UTI or urinary tract infection. In males, the anus is located somewhere back behind all of this anatomy that we see here, but bacteria from the anus would actually have to travel along the penis into the urethra and quite a long distance before it reached the bladder. Therefore, urinary tract infections are much less common. Okay, I think that's it for the main anatomy. What I want to talk about next is the anatomy of the kidney itself. So we're going to start by looking at the gross anatomy of the kidney. Now, each of the kidneys is surrounded by a fibrous capsule, which is what you see here, this shiny brown bit. So that wraps around the entire kidney, helping to keep it intact. And the ureters emanate from the kidney or come out of the kidney and are part of this tube system that is really just designed to catch and deliver the urine to the bladder. The action takes place in the internal part of the kidney that's not part of this tubing. So if we take a frontal section of the kidney, which is what this is, it sort of resembles, if you're very creative and squint your eyes and use your imagination, sort of resembles a pizza. With each slice of pizza, here's one slice designated by the dotted line, representing a lobe of the kidney. So this is one lobe of the kidney, this is another lobe of the kidney, and another lobe. And within each lobe is the equipment or the anatomical equipment that allows the kidney to filter the plasma. Now, there are two parts to each one of these lobes. There's the outer part here, where you can see some of these blood vessels. It's just inside the fibrous capsule. This is like the pizza crust that doesn't have the sauce and cheese on it, and this is known as the cortex, which roughly translates to mean crust, oddly enough, but it's the outer part. The inner part here, which is where the sauce and cheese and toppings would be, is known as the medulla, which means middle. And the structures that are going to be filtering the plasma are located both within the cortex and the medulla, and depending on where they are able to contribute differently to the functions of the kidney. Okay, so we've got the lobes of the kidney, the cortex here, the medulla here, here's medulla here. So all of this middle portion would be medulla. And these structures that look like brooms are called renal pyramids. And the reason that they look like brooms is because the structures inside are actually very straight, very narrow tubes. So just like the bristles of a broom, what we're seeing here are the tubes that we're going to be talking about momentarily. Without yet having talked about how plasma filtration takes place, let me just say that the plasma gets filtered here, and there are little holes that we really can't see in this diagram very well at the bottom of the renal pyramid. These are called papillae. And this is where the urine drips out. If you've ever watched a coffee maker after you start it, and the water passes through the coffee filter, and the coffee drips out of the filter, that's very much what this would look like, except it's urine and not coffee. It's caught in these little cups, like your coffee carafe on the coffee maker. And these are called the calyces. Calyx is singular. These calyces merge together to form a bigger and bigger calyx until it reaches a point where of an enlarged tube known as the renal pelvis, and then that leads into the ureter. So that's the basic gross anatomy of the kidney. Now, The kidney, because it's filtering plasma, has a very close, intricate relationship with blood supply. So when we look at the anatomy of the kidney, we're going to look at the parts that are just kidney, and then we're going to look at the circulation in the kidney, and then we're going to take a moment and put them together so that it makes sense where they intersect. While I'm on this diagram, I will point out that we've got these two vessels that are carrying blood to and from the kidney. This is the renal artery here, and you can see it's bringing blood, oxygen-rich blood into the kidney, and then it starts to branch. It does not actually reach dead ends like the diagram would make you think, but we'll see that better in another diagram in a moment. Leaving the kidney is the renal vein, which is carrying deoxygenated or oxygen-poor blood. In addition to thinking about the oxygen status of the blood, I want you to think in terms of where the wastes are. So the renal arteries are carrying oxygen-rich blood, and the oxygen is going to be used by the kidneys, but they're also carrying nitrogenous wastes. So the kidneys have to take the oxygen and also take the wastes and do different things with them. The clean blood, the blood that's had the nitrogenous wastes removed, but also the oxygen, leaves the kidney through the renal vein.